The first time Celine Ardent screamed at me, she was wrong. I want to be clear about that before anything else. She was wrong. And she knew she was wrong. And the moment she realized it, standing in the narrow stairwell of the Delacroix building, with both palms flat against the concrete wall on either side of my shoulders, and her breath coming hard and her voice gone completely silent, that was the moment I understood that this was never going to be simple. That was also the moment I understood that I was already, irreversibly, in trouble. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. Let me back up. My name is Amara Solis. I am 31 years old. I am the junior archivist at the Delacroix Institute for Cultural Preservation. I drink too much coffee and not enough water, and I have a documented professional history of making enemies out of people who become important to me. My supervisor, Dr. Benoit, calls it a pattern. My younger sister, Teo, calls it a personality. My mother calls it being too much. I prefer to think of it as having standards that other people find inconvenient, which is the generous version, and which I repeat to myself regularly as a kind of maintenance. The Delacroix Institute sits on the eastern edge of the old financial district, occupying a building that was originally a textile warehouse in the 1800s and has since been renovated 3 times to the point where almost nothing original remains except the exposed iron beams on the 4th floor and the narrow service stairwell that runs from the basement, archives all the way to the roof access. The building smells like climate-controlled air and old paper and the specific brand of institutional seriousness that settles into places where people have been caring deeply about very old things for a very long time. I love it more than I have loved most humans. That is not a brag. It is simply accurate. I had been at the Delacroix for 14 months when Celine Ardent arrived. She came as the new head of conservation, hired to oversee the physical restoration of the Institute's collection after the previous director retired mid-project and left 3 incomplete restoration contracts and a storage room of cataloging backlog that made my eye twitch every time I had to walk past it. The board had apparently recruited Celine from a prestigious position in Lyon, where she had led a significant restoration of a collection of 18th-century correspondence that had been damaged in a flood. Her credentials were, objectively, exceptional. I had read her published papers before she arrived because preparation is one of the few things I can control, and because I wanted to understand who I would be working with before I had to smile at them. Her papers were meticulous, precise, written with a clarity that was almost aggressive, as if she had no patience for imprecision in any form and was extending that impatience into every sentence she put on the page. I had admired the papers and formed the immediate suspicion that I would not particularly enjoy the person who had written them. In my experience, the people most committed to precision tend to be the people least tolerant of the kind of intuitive, contextual thinking that archival work actually requires, and the combination of those two things creates a specific type of professional friction that I have encountered enough times to recognize on approach. I was not wrong about the friction. I was wrong about almost everything else. The morning Celine arrived, I was on my knees in the east corridor of the archives, reboxing a set of maps that had been improperly stored by someone in the previous administration and were showing early signs of the kind of edge deterioration that becomes a crisis if you ignore it. My back was to the door. I heard Dr. Benoit's voice doing the tour and introduction thing he did with new senior staff, and I heard another voice responding, and the other voice was lower than I expected, a little rough at the edges, with the particular quality of someone whose first language was French, and who had learned English as a functional tool rather than a pleasure. I registered all of this without turning around, because I was in the middle of positioning a map that required both hands and my full attention. Imara, Dr. Benoit said, "Come and meet Dr. Ardent." I completed the positioning, set the archival weight, and stood up, and then I turned. She was tall. That was the first thing. Taller than I had visualized from the papers, which is a strange thing to say but is true. She had dark red hair, not the bright theatrical kind, but the deep, almost brown kind that looks nearly black in low light, cut to just below her jaw in a way that was severe and exactly suited to her face. The face itself was angular, strong jaw, high cheekbones, a nose that had clearly been broken once and healed slightly off-center, in a way that made her look less like a portrait and more like a person. She was wearing a charcoal linen blazer over a black turtleneck, and she had ink on 2 fingers of her right hand. She was looking at the map I had just boxed with an expression that was not quite a frown and not quite a question, but something in between, as if she had already identified something about the storage method that she intended to have an opinion about later. I said, "Dr. Ardent, welcome." She looked at me. Her eyes were an odd color, somewhere between amber and green, and the look was the kind that takes in a person the way a professional takes in a document efficiently, completely, without performing politeness. Imara Solis, she said. You published the piece on the Fontaine correspondence in the spring issue of the Archive Quarterly. I did. The methodology section had a gap. She said it without cruelty and without warmth, like a fact. The room was very quiet. Dr. Benoit made a small sound. I said, the gap was intentional. The paper was already at the word limit. I addressed the full methodology in the expanded version published 6 months later. She was quiet for a beat. I watched her register this and recalibrate. I haven't read the expanded version, she said. It's in the directory. I'll find it, doctor. Benoit said something about showing her the conservation lab. They left. I went back to my maps. I was aware, without being entirely sure why, that something had just shifted in the ambient conditions of my professional life, the way you can feel a pressure change before the weather turns without being able to say exactly what it portends. The first 3 weeks were navigable. Solène was present in the building in the way that some people are simply impossible to miss, regardless of proximity. You became aware when she entered a room, when she left one, when her particular kind of focused silence occupied the corridor outside the archive stacks. She moved through the building with the purposeful economy of someone who had already mapped the space and located every inefficiency in it. She rarely spoke unless she was saying something specific. She did not engage in the small social rituals of shared lunches or coffee room conversation. She worked from early morning until evening. And on at least 2 occasions, I arrived early to find she was already there, standing at the light table in the conservation lab, reading a damaged document through a magnifying glass with the whole of her attention. I did not find her easy. I found her, instead, consistent in a way that was almost confrontational, because consistency of that kind makes demands on everyone around it. It requires a matching seriousness, and seriousness is exhausting to sustain. I also found her, and here I will be honest, because this is the kind of story that falls apart if I am not honest in the early sections. I found her difficult to stop noticing. The ink on her fingers, the precise way she replaced every item she used to exactly the position she had found it. The single small scar above her left eyebrow that whitened slightly when she concentrated. The way she used silences the way other people use punctuation, not from discomfort but from precision, as if she only wanted words in the spaces where words were the correct tool. None of this was relevant. She was my senior colleague and my practical superior in the institutional hierarchy, and the Delacroix had strict professional conduct guidelines, and I had a documented history of making things complicated. I noted all of this and returned to my work and was largely successful, for approximately 3 weeks, at keeping the noticing on the purely observational side of a clear internal boundary. Then the Moreau collection incident happened, and the stairwell and the screaming, and everything became considerably less simple. The Moreau collection was a donation of personal papers, photographs, and material artifacts from the estate of a textile industrialist who had died the previous year and left his entire archive to the Institute. It was a significant acquisition, some 6,000 individual items spanning the late 19th century to the 1970s, and it had arrived in a state that indicated the estate had been storing it in a room, with inadequate climate control for at least the last decade. The photographs in particular were showing signs of chemical deterioration that put them on a timeline that the conservation team was tracking carefully. My role was cataloging. Solène's team was responsible for physical stabilization and restoration priority assessment. In theory, these were parallel processes with a simple handoff protocol. In practice, the handoff protocol had been written by someone who did not understand archival cataloging, and it created a situation where my team was regularly waiting for stabilization assessments before we could complete catalog entries, which meant our timeline was chronically dependent on conservation's pace, which Solène ran according to her own assessment of priority that did not always align with the institutional cataloging deadline. I raised this with Dr. Benoit. He suggested I raise it directly with Dr. Ardent. I raised it directly with Dr. Ardent. What followed was the kind of professional disagreement that is technically civil and practically combative. 2 people, speaking with complete courtesy about a workflow problem, while both of them are quietly certain the other person is the problem. Solène held that conservation assessment could not be rushed without creating risk to the material. I held that the assessment timeline had to account for institutional deadlines that affected the entire archive program. She was not wrong. I was not wrong. We were both entirely right and completely unable to make the rightness meet. We met about it twice in a formal setting, reached no resolution, and both returned to our respective domains with the polite mutual intractability of people who have too much professional self-control to have the actual argument they need to have. The actual argument arrived 6 weeks in the form of a Tuesday afternoon in October, when I discovered that a set of Moreau photographs I had scheduled for cataloging had been pulled from the accessible queue and returned to restricted storage without notice. Conservation had reclassified them based on a new assessment of their deterioration level, which was within Solen's authority, but the reclassification had not been communicated to my team, which meant I had 3 archivists who had organized their work week around accessing those materials and were now facing a gap I had to solve by end of business. I found out because one of my junior archivists, a careful, anxious young man named Piers who dealt with professional disruptions the way some people deal with physical injuries by becoming very pale and very still, came to my office and told me with the expression of someone delivering news that they already know will not be well received. I walked to the conservation lab. Solen was not there. I walked to her office. The door was open, but the room was empty. I walked to the stairwell, which is the route between the conservation lab and the restricted storage area, and halfway up the second flight, I found her. She was coming down. I was going up. The stairwell is narrow in the way of old industrial buildings. 2 people can pass, but barely, and there is no comfortable distance to maintain. She had a binder under one arm and a pen in her other hand, and she looked up when she heard my footsteps, and her expression was the default one, that particular composed neutrality that she carried like a second garment, and it was the neutrality itself that finally made something in me arrive. "Dr. Ardent," I said. "The Moreau photographs," she said, "the L series. They were reclassified this morning, without notification to my team." Her expression shifted slightly. Her office received the reclassification memo. Her office, not mine. I require direct communication when materials scheduled for active cataloging are made inaccessible. Something behind her eyes sharpened. "The protocol specifies office notification. I followed the protocol. The protocol is inadequate. I've been saying so for 6 weeks. Then you should take that up with Dr. Benoit." She said it without inflection, and in another context it would have been reasonable, and it was in fact reasonable. And it was also the 3rd time in 6 weeks that a legitimate concern I had raised had been redirected to institutional process, rather than addressed in the conversation where I'd raised it. And something in me simply ran out of the kind of patience that is actually exhaustion performing as professionalism. I said, with a heat I did not quite manage to control, that taking things to Dr. Benoit was not the same as having them resolved, that I had 3 archivists whose work week I now needed to restructure on approximately 4 hours' notice, that the assumption that office-level notification was adequate in a collaborative workflow demonstrated either a misunderstanding of how cataloging actually functioned or a deliberate indifference to it, and that neither of those was acceptable from a head of department at the institution's seniority level. It came out fast and it came out sharp and it was not diplomatic, and I could hear all of that even as I was saying it. Solen went very still on the stairs above me. Then she said, and her voice was precise and cold in the way that ice is not cold from the surface, but from whatever is underneath it. She said that if I had concerns about her department's competence, I should document them formally rather than raising my voice in a stairwell, and that she had not, in fact, been hired to accommodate scheduling convenience at the expense of material safety, and that she would appreciate it if I remembered that distinction in future. She said appreciate it if I remembered those words. Something in me went sideways and I said, very quietly, that I was not questioning her competence, that I was questioning her assumption that the material was the only thing in the room that required care, and that some things needed more than the protocol to actually function. She said, "That is not a professional concern, Miss Solis. Miss Solis, not Dr. Ardent to Imara, the way it had been for 6 weeks. Miss Solis." The stairwell was very quiet. Then I said something I immediately knew was too much. I said that professional concern was not the only kind that mattered in a collaborative environment, and that she might consider whether the reason the workflow kept breaking down was not the protocol but the fact that she treated every human variable in the system as an obstacle to the work, rather than as part of it. That landed. I could see it land. The stillness that was already in her body went a different kind of still, not composed, but arrested. There was 1 second, maybe 2, where her expression did something I could not name, and then it closed back down, but it closed differently than it had opened. She came down the last 2 stairs. The stairwell was narrow, and she stopped directly in front of me, close in the way that a small space makes unavoidable, and she put one hand flat against the wall on my left, then the other hand against the wall on my right. I was not trapped, there was space between us, a foot at least, And I could have stepped forward and she would have moved, but the posture was not confrontational the way the words had been. It was something else. Something involuntary. Something that belonged to a different part of her than the professional one. And she seemed to know it the moment it happened because her voice, when she spoke, was not cold. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that is not control but the approximation of it. She said nothing for 4 full seconds. I counted them the way you count seconds when you are aware of every increment. Then she said, "That was unfair." I said, "I know. I'm sorry." I stopped. I said, "That was out of line." She removed her hands from the wall, one slow movement on each side. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I had no adequate category for, and then she looked at the middle distance over my shoulder, and her jaw moved once in a way that was not speaking, just processing. "I will ask my team to send direct notification going forward," she said, "when active catalog materials are reclassified." I should have structured it that way from the beginning. I said, "Thank you." She said, "I am not indifferent to the human variables. I want to be clear about that. I know you're not." I said it before I decided to say it, which told me something I was not quite ready to look at directly. She picked up the binder she had set on the step. She straightened her blazer. She looked at me once more and the expression was entirely neutral again, fully recomposed, and under different circumstances I would have read that as the end of the conversation, the professional shutters coming back down. But I had been watching her for 6 weeks, and I had learned without meaning to, without particularly wanting to, I had learned the small signals that existed in her composure before the composure fully arrived, the fraction of a second in her eyes before the neutrality settled, the way her right hand stilled against whatever she was holding when she was managing something she did not intend to display. Both of those things were happening. "I will send the workflow proposal to Benoit by Friday," she said. "Revised." I said, "I'll send my comments by Thursday." She nodded once, left the stairwell. Her footsteps went down and around the turn and out of sound. I stood on the stairs with my hand on the iron railing and tried to identify what I was feeling. It was not exactly relief, because the argument had been real and the apology had been necessary and none of that was gone. It was not whatever I had felt at the beginning of the conversation when I was still composed and operating from appropriate professional register. It was something that sat in the middle of those two things, shaken in a specific way, scraped clean of something I had been carrying for 6 weeks without realizing I was carrying it. My junior archivist Piers was waiting at the bottom of the stairs with a look that said he was prepared to hear either very good or very bad news and had pre-braced for both. "Reschedule for Thursday," I said. "We'll have access." He exhaled. I went to my office and sat at my desk and looked at my hands for a moment longer than was useful, and then I opened my laptop and started restructuring the week's work plan with the careful, focused attention that is the only reliable cure I know for the kind of feeling that has no immediately productive outlet. The workflow proposal that arrived Friday was thorough. Solène had restructured the notification protocol to require direct department-level communication on any materials flagged for active cataloging work, had proposed a shared status board that both teams could access in real time, and had included a note at the bottom, not in the body of the document but below the institutional footer, in handwriting rather than type, because apparently she had printed and signed it rather than sending it electronically, that said, simply, "The methodology section gap in the Fontaine paper." The expanded version addressed it more precisely than the original should have required. The argument was better for being complete. S.A. I sat with that note for a long time. I wrote a response to the proposal, accepted the revisions, suggested 2 amendments to the shared board structure that I thought would reduce redundancy. I sent it to Dr. Benoit and copied Solène. I did not comment on the handwritten note. I was not sure what commenting would mean, and I had a clear memory of standing on a stairwell and understanding, in the particular way that physical memory is different from intellectual memory, that clarity in this case required patience. The shared board went live 10 days later. The workflow improved immediately and substantially in the way that good systems always improve things, not dramatically but structurally, in the quiet, reliable way that makes the underlying work easier without calling attention to itself. Solène and I crossed paths every day. The institute was not large. We shared the 4th floor corridor, the East Wing common area, the good light table in the conservation wing that both teams occasionally needed. We shared the stairwell regularly, which was unavoidable, and which I handled by becoming very deliberate about my gaze and my pace and the specific distance I maintained, because the stairwell now had a quality to it that I did not have language for. We were professional. We were, I think, more than professional. There was a quality to the directness between us now that was cleaner than politeness, that felt more like the beginning of something specific than a return to neutral. She sent me questions about catalog entries, and I sent her answers, and occasionally she pushed back on the answer, and I pushed back on the pushback, and neither of us made it anything other than two people thinking hard about the work, except that I was increasingly aware that the way I looked forward to those exchanges was not adequately explained by professional engagement alone. My colleague Adisa noticed before I admitted it to myself. Adisa was senior to me in tenure, if not in title. A large, quiet man from Accra who had worked in the Institute's photography archive for 11 years and had the quality of some long-term archivists of seeming to exist slightly outside of time, as if the decades of working with historical material had given him a patience with the present that most people don't develop. He noticed everything in the way of someone who processed information slowly and completely, and he had a habit of delivering his observations with a mildness that made them impossible to deflect. He stopped beside my desk one afternoon in November and looked at the email I was composing a response to Solen's query about a photographic dating discrepancy in the Moreau materials, and he said, "You spend more time on those than on anything else." I said, "It's a complex question." He said, I sent the email, and then I made the mistake of looking at him. He had the expression of someone who has already arrived at a conclusion and is extending the courtesy of letting you arrive at it yourself. I said, "It is a complex question. The dating is genuinely ambiguous. The photographic chemistry suggests one period and the subject matter suggests another." He said, "I wasn't talking about the chemistry." He went back to his desk. I sat with my hands over my keyboard for a long moment, and then I finished the email with the particular precision of someone demonstrating to themselves that they are focused. Solen's response arrived 40 minutes later. She had attached 2 scanned reference documents from a photographic history archive in Paris that she had accessed through a professional network contact, which she had clearly obtained specifically to support the analysis of the discrepancy, which meant she had gone outside her immediate resources to pursue a question that was technically mine to resolve and not hers. Her note said only, "The second document is more useful. The paper stock dating aligns. I, not S, A, not Dr. Ardent. I, read the note twice. Then I read it a third time to confirm it was the same note I thought it was. Then I forwarded both documents to peers with the relevant instructions and sat for a moment in the particular stillness of someone who has received information they already knew, but are only now permitted to fully know. I went to find her. She was in the conservation lab, which was where she spent most of her afternoons, a long room with north-facing windows and equipment I had learned the names of over the past 3 months as a kind of involuntary education: the light tables, the humidity monitors, the conservation microscope, the drying racks with their careful arrangement of partially treated materials. She was at the microscope when I came in. She did not look up immediately. The work she was doing required a steadiness that made interruption impolite, and I knew enough by now to wait. I stood near the door. The lab smelled like the specific clean chemistry of conservation work and like the paper and fabric of old things being carefully brought back. The afternoon light from the north windows was long and flat and made everything in the room look slightly more than real. After a moment, she lifted her head from the microscope. She saw me and she did not look surprised, which meant she had known I was there. She had probably heard the door. "The documents," I said. She was quiet. "Thank you." I paused. "You didn't have to do that. I know." I waited to see if she would say anything else. She was still at the microscope, hands resting on the table, looking at me with that quality of attention that I had spent 3 months learning was not blankness but the opposite, a very directed focus that she extended to things she found significant and withheld from things she didn't. "It was a useful question," she said finally. "It deserved a complete answer." I said, "So did the Fontaine paper." The edge of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. The kind that arrives and then thinks better of being too visible. "The Fontaine paper was 4 years ago," she said. I was being critical without sufficient context. I said, "You were right to identify the gap." The context didn't change the gap. She was quiet again. She picked up a fine brush from the tray beside the microscope and set it down again in a different position. Not using it, just giving her hands something to do. That was not the conversation. I recognized the motion. I had seen it before in the specific moments when she was managing something she was not yet ready to say. The air in the lab was very still. I said, "I think we got off to a difficult start." She looked at me. I said, I came in with a set of assumptions about how this collaboration would work, and I didn't revise them quickly enough when the actual situation turned out to be different from what I expected. I said it directly because I had had 3 months to consider it, and it was accurate, and I had a growing sense that accuracy was the currency Solène valued most. She was quiet for a long time. "What did you expect?" she said. "Friction," I said. "I read your papers before you arrived, and I expected someone who would prioritize the theoretical rigidity of the methodology over the practical realities of shared work. I was wrong about that. You have been more flexible than your papers suggest." She said, "Your papers suggest something similar." I said, "I know." She looked at me with something in her expression that had not been there in the previous version of the conversation, something that was both more careful and more open, as if the professional caution was still present but had moved to make room for something else. She said, "I had a conversation with Dr. Benoit when I first arrived. He told me you were the most capable archivist he had worked with in 15 years and that you were going to find me difficult to work with." I said, "He's usually right about both of those categories of thing." Her expression shifted further toward the thing I had no name for. She said, "He was right about both." The lab was very quiet. The humidity monitor made a soft sound. Outside the north windows, the afternoon light was beginning to lengthen toward early dark, the November shift that happened earlier than it seemed it should. I said, "I should let you finish." "I know," she said, but she did not look at the microscope. There was a moment, a specific moment that I can place exactly, because it is the kind of moment that has a location in time, the way certain photographs have a quality that makes them feel like a record of something, rather than just an image where neither of us moved and neither of us spoke, and the air between us held a particular density, not uncomfortable but impossible to ignore. The kind of pressure that builds when two things are in proximity to each other and are not yet sure what the contact will mean. Then she picked up the brush again, positioned it, and looked back at the microscope. "The dating paper," she said. "If you want to include it in the catalog entry, I can provide an authentication note for the supplementary record." I said, "That would be useful, thank you." I left. In the corridor outside the lab, I stopped with my back against the wall and looked at the iron beam above me and breathed slowly and deliberately for several seconds, because the alternative was to stand there and feel everything at once, which was not something I was prepared to do in the middle of a Thursday afternoon. Adisa was in the corridor. He had a folder under his arm and he looked at me with the mildness that was not quite amusement and not quite knowing. He said, "Complex question?" I said, "Extremely." He went to his desk. I went to mine. The afternoon was entirely unremarkable after that, which is the particular quality of moments that have changed something. They arrive in the middle of ordinary days and they leave everything around them looking normal while nothing inside is quite the same arrangement. It was before. The Institute's winter reception happened the second week of December. It was a small institutional event staff and board, no public drinks and a catered spread in the fourth floor common area, the kind of event that exists to create a social occasion out of people who are already in daily professional proximity and sometimes need the permission of a formal context to speak to each other as humans rather than colleagues. I wore a black dress and my good earrings and arrived slightly late because Teo called while I was leaving my apartment, and she always calls at the worst moments and always has something worth listening to, and also because slightly late is preferable to early and having to perform relaxed sociality for the maximum possible duration. The room was lit warmly. There were perhaps 30 people. I got a glass of wine from the table and made my way through the reliable stations doctor. Benoit and the board chair discussing the Institute's acquisition priorities for the next year. Two of my junior archivists huddled near the window with the body language of people conducting a private conversation at a public event. Adisa standing beside the catering table with the contentment of someone who appreciates good food without needing to perform enthusiasm about it. I found a position near the east wall where I could observe the room without being centered in it, which is my preferred reception posture, and I let the evening do what receptions do, which is proceed in a way that is neither exciting nor unpleasant. Then Solène came through the door and the room did the thing it always did when she entered, which was to organize itself slightly around the fact of her presence without anyone doing so deliberately. She was wearing something I had not seen her in before, a deep blue that was almost navy, structured at the shoulders and simple everywhere else, and her hair was the same severe line at her jaw, but she had left something of the professional armor at the door or perhaps at home, because she moved through the room differently than she moved through the Institute. Not slower, but less deliberate, as if the context allowed her body more latitude. She spoke to Dr. Benoit. She spoke to the head of the photography archive. She accepted a glass of wine and held it the way she held everything, with a steadiness that was native and not performed. Then she came to stand near me, not beside me, not in a way that committed to a conversation. Simply near, with 2 or 3 feet of common area space between us, both of us facing the room, both of us with wine. After a moment, she said, "You were late." I said, "My sister called. Is she well?" "Yes. She always calls at the worst moment. It's a pattern." Something touched the corner of Solene's mouth. "A sibling?" "Younger," I said, "by 3 years. She teaches secondary school science in Montclair, and she has the quality of scientists of being completely uninterested in whether any given moment is convenient for the experiment." She looked at the room for a moment. "I have no siblings. I used to find that isolating. Now I think it mostly means I have an unrealistically clear sense of what silence can mean." I said, "That's a very precise thing to say about solitude." She said, "Precision is more reliable than approximation." I said, "In some domains." She looked at me sideways. Not a full turn, just a fraction, the way she looked at things. She was deciding how much attention to give. "Not in all of them," she said. I said, "Some things require the margin, the space between the precise answer and the actually true one." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the room. She said, "I have been working on being less rigid about that." I said, "I know. The workflow proposal was different from what I expected." She said, "You push back well." I find that she stopped, paused for a fraction of a second that was just long enough to be a decision. She said, "Useful." She said useful in the way of someone who had selected the word from a set of words, and this was not the word they had chosen first. I held my wine glass and looked at the room and felt something move through me that was warm and specific and not at all professional, and I made the deliberate choice to not look at her directly for several seconds because I needed those seconds to be functional. The institute director was making his way to the center of the room to offer remarks. The small crowd shifted and compacted. Solene moved with it and I moved with it, and the several feet between us reduced by half without either of us creating the reduction. The remarks were brief acquisition highlights, staff acknowledgements, the year-end note of appreciation that these things always include and that is never exactly personal but is not insincere either. Dr. Benoit was mentioned. The Moreau collection was mentioned. Solene's name was mentioned alongside mine in the context of the improved collaboration protocol, and I felt her go slightly still beside me in the way she went still when something arrived that she had not prepared a response to. The director raised his glass. The room echoed it. Solene and I raised ours simultaneously, and she glanced at me in the moment that we did, and I was looking at her at the same time, which meant our eyes met at the exact angle of the toast, which was not planned and which could not have been planned, and the moment lasted longer than toasts require because neither of us looked away immediately. She looked away first. I looked at my wine. The reception continued. People drifted and reformed into different configurations. I spoke with the board chair about the Institute's digital preservation initiative, and I spoke with peers about a catalog entry he had a question about, and I ate several items from the catering table that were unremarkable and ate them with the focused gratitude of someone who needed something grounding to do with their hands. At some point in the later portion of the evening, near the point where receptions begin to thin as people remember that it is a weekday, I went to the window to look out at the city. The Institute is high enough on its street that the 4th floor has a view of the river at the eastern end of the block, and at night the river holds light differently than anything else in the city, a moving darkness threaded with reflections that never quite resolves. Solene appeared beside me. She stood close, not touching, not quite, but close in the way of someone who has made a decision about proximity and is allowing it to stand. We looked at the river. She said, quietly and without looking at me, "I owe you a more direct apology than the one I gave in the stairwell." I turned to look at her. She was still looking at the window. I said, "You apologized. You revised the protocol." The apology was complete. She said, "The professional component was complete." She paused. The other component was not. The room behind us had reduced to perhaps a dozen people. The lighting was lower than it had been. She said, "When I said Miss Solis, she stopped." Her jaw moved once in that way it moved when she was finding the word that was both precise and true. I was demonstrating that I had the institutional authority to reframe the conversation on my terms. It was deliberate and it was unkind. I said, "I know." She looked at me then. "I know that you know," she said. "I'm saying it explicitly because I would prefer you to hear it from me explicitly rather than to simply know it." I held her gaze. The river was in the window behind me and the room behind her, and we were between them in the warm, low light. I said, "Why does that matter to you?" It was not quite a question. More a thing I said to make room for whatever came after it. She was quiet for long enough that I thought she was not going to answer. Then she said, "Because I would prefer for you to have an accurate account of who I am." The warmth in me was not wine. It was specific and deliberate, and it settled in my chest like something that had been arriving for several months and had only now found the door. I said, "I have an accurate account of who you are. I've had one for longer than the workflow protocol." She looked at me very steadily. She said, "That is..." She stopped again, and this time the stopping was not the word selection pause. It was something else, something closer, a held breath. What she said finally was, "That is not uncomplicated to hear." I said, "I know." She looked at the window, at the river, back at me. She said, "I don't do this well." I said, "I don't think either of us does." She said, "That is not actually reassuring." "It wasn't meant to be," I said. "It was meant to be accurate." The edge of her mouth moved, slowly, all the way to a real expression this time, not the near smile or the managed amusement, but something genuine and a little unguarded, and I was aware that I was seeing something she did not put on display, and that the awareness of it was its own category of feeling. She said, "The Fontaine expanded paper. I found it the same afternoon I told you I hadn't read it." I said, "I know." She said, "You couldn't have known that." I said, "No, but I suspected." She looked at me for a long moment. Then one of the board members appeared at her elbow with a question about the conservation initiative, and the moment closed around itself, and she turned with the full, composed, professional attention that she brought to everything, and I stood at the window with the river behind me and held my wine glass and felt the particular quality of an evening that has said more than it intended to and will require a great deal of processing. I left shortly after. The night outside was cold, the December kind of cold that has no moisture in it, just clarity and the smell of winter pavement. I walked to the subway with my hands in my coat pockets and did not try to think about the evening in an organized way, because some things require the margin, and the space between the precise answer and the actually true one is exactly where I seem to have been living for the past 3 months, and there was no reason to rush the resolution when the approach was still this particular kind of alive. Adiza texted me at 10:30 that night. The text said only, "Complex question." I replied, "Ongoing analysis." He replied with a single period, which I had learned over 11 months of working with him was his version of laughing. I put my phone down and lay on my back in the dark of my apartment and looked at the ceiling with its water-stained map of the previous tenant's bad luck and thought about amber eyes and the specific quality of a silence that is not empty, but full of exactly the thing neither person is yet ready to say. I thought about a hand on each side of a stairwell wall. I thought about the fraction of a pause between useful and whatever word she had selected it from. I thought about "I would prefer for you to have an accurate account of who I am," which was the most formal and most devastating way I had ever been told that my impression of someone mattered to them. I also thought, with the clarity that comes at night when the rest of the performed architecture of a day has fallen away, that I was in significantly deeper than I had been in the stairwell, and significantly deeper than I had been in the conservation lab, and that the resolution I was not rushing toward was already visible from wherever I was currently standing, in the way that a lighthouse is visible from a distance even when you are still deciding whether to turn the boat. I turned out the light. In the morning, there was an email from Solène timestamped at 11:47, which meant she had sent it after I had fallen asleep. The subject line was the number of a catalog entry in the Moreau collection. The body of the email was 3 lines of precise professional language about a dating question that she had identified and thought my team should be aware of before the entry was finalized. At the bottom, below her name and below the institutional signature, was a handwritten scan again. 4 words. "Did you sleep well?" Not a question mark. A period. The way she would write a fact. I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold beside me and looked at those 4 words and felt something settle in me with a completeness that was both very simple and entirely not. I wrote back 3 paragraphs on the dating question. Precise, thorough. At the bottom, better than expected. The email went at 7:14. Her reply came at 7:22. Good. S. January arrived the way January always does in the city. Without ceremony and with a cold that has forgotten it is supposed to be temporary. The Institute felt different in winter. The high windows let in a quality of light that was flat and white and honest, the kind that shows the actual condition of things rather than the more forgiving version that autumn and spring allow. The exposed iron beams on the fourth floor looked older. The archive stack smelled more concentrated. The narrow stairwell, which I continued to use because it was the most direct route between my floor and the restricted storage area and not at all for any other reason, felt like a place that had been marked by something and was waiting to find out whether the marking meant anything. Solen and I worked in parallel through the first weeks of January with the fluency of two people who have found the functional rhythm of collaboration and are using it, consciously or not, to hold something else in suspension. The shared status board ran smoothly. The Moreau collection cataloging advanced at a pace that Dr. Benoit described in a staff update as exceptional. Peers, who had spent the autumn in a state of low-grade professional anxiety, began arriving to the archive with the expression of someone whose work environment had become reliable, which I took as one of the more meaningful indicators of how things had shifted. The handwritten notes continued. Not daily, that would have been too visible, to ourselves if not to anyone else, but often enough that I began to feel their absence on the days they did not arrive. Solen's notes were never long. They were always attached to professional communication, always below the institutional footer, always in that precise, slightly slanted hand that I had learned to identify at the bottom of my inbox before I opened the message, a catalog observation, a reference she thought I should see. Once, a single line about a piece of music playing through the conservation lab windows from a rehearsal space across the street that she had found unexpectedly affecting and could not account for. She had not explained why she was telling me. She had not needed to. My notes back were similar, precise, attached to something professional, saying the thing adjacent to the thing. Adisa said nothing. He watched, with the patience of someone who had decided that the most useful thing he could offer was the space to arrive at things in one's own time, and he said nothing, and I was grateful for that with a depth that I did not express, because Adisa was not a man who needed expression to understand a thing. The complication arrived, as complications do, from outside. The board of the Delacroix Institute included among its members a woman named Harriet Voss, who had been on the board for 9 years and who functioned as the primary liaison between the Institute's institutional operations and its donor community. She was in her late 60s, impeccably presented in the way of someone for whom presentation is a professional tool rather than a personal preference, and she had a quality that I had observed at a distance and confirmed in several brief interactions of viewing the Institute and its staff primarily through the lens of what each element contributed to the institution's external reputation. She was not malicious. That is important to say. She was, in fact, genuinely committed to the Institute's mission in the way of people who have given significant time and resources to an institution and have absorbed its identity into their own sense of purpose. The problem with people like Harriet Voss is not bad faith. It is the particular kind of faith that has calcified around a very specific vision and becomes defensive when anything approaches the edges of that vision. What approached the edges of her vision, in the third week of January, was a remark made at a donor lunch by a board member who had noticed because people notice things, and the notice travels that the Institute's new head of conservation and the senior archivist seemed to have developed what he described as an unusually close working relationship. I heard about the remark from Dr. Benoit, who called me into his office on a Thursday morning with the expression of a man who finds himself in a position he did not arrange and does not prefer. He told me about the lunch. He told me the remark had been made by a board member whose name he did not give me, and who he characterized as someone whose interest in institutional gossip was inversely proportional to his contributions to the actual work. He told me that Harriet Voss had, in response to the remark, not dismissed it but instead filed a note with the board chair, requesting that the Institute review its conduct guidelines as they pertain to senior staff relationships. I sat across from Dr. Benoit and kept my face neutral and let him finish. There is nothing in the conduct guidelines, he said carefully, that would prohibit a professional relationship from developing into something else, provided it is disclosed and does not create a supervisory conflict. He paused. There is also, at the present moment, nothing to disclose. He looked at me. I looked at him. He said, I am telling you this because I prefer you to have accurate information rather than to encounter the effects of a conversation without understanding its source. He paused again. I am also telling you because I would rather this institution's formal processes not be used to create pressure on members of staff who have not done anything that requires addressing. I said, Thank you, Dr. Benoit. He said, Does Dr. Ardent know? I said, I will speak with her. He nodded. He looked at his desk. He said, The Moreau collection is the best managed major acquisition this institute has had in a decade. I want that on the record of this conversation. I said, I'll note it. He almost smiled. I left his office and stood in the corridor and let myself feel, for a precise and private 30 seconds, the specific quality of anger that arrives when something clean is handled by people who see in it only what it reflects about their own concerns. Then I put it down and went to find Selene. She was in the stairwell. Not at a landing, not transitioning between floors, she was standing on the third floor step with her back against the wall and her eyes on the middle distance and the posture of someone who already knew. You heard, I said. Harriet Voss's assistant is indiscreet, she said, and carries a personal dislike of me that dates to a disagreement over the treatment of a donated textile 3 years ago. I came down to stand on the step below hers, which put us at the same height. Her face in the winter stairwell light was very still. I said, there is nothing in the conduct guidelines. I know. She was quiet. Her hands were folded in front of her, not tense, just gathered. What she said next, she said with her eyes on mine and her voice entirely level. This is going to require a decision. I said, I know. She said, I do not make these decisions quickly. I said, I know that too. Something moved across her face. It was not quite the near smile. It was something more serious and more open. She said, Imara. She said my name the way she said the things she was being most precise about. Not Imara the way a normal person says a name. The way you say something you have been thinking about the pronunciation of for a long time. I want to be clear about what I am deciding. The stairwell was very quiet. A door opened somewhere below us and then closed. Neither of us moved. She said, I have been... She stopped. Selected. Started again. I have been aware of you, she said, since the morning I arrived and you were kneeling in the corridor with a map that you were handling with more care than most people give to things that deserve it. I noted it and I put it somewhere I intended to leave it. I was not successful. I said, I know. She said, I did not intend for it to become what it has become. I said, neither did I. I paused. I'm not sorry that it did. Her breath shifted slightly. Just slightly. She said, I am also not sorry. That is the problem. I said, I'm not sure that's a problem. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, I am going to need more time before I can be as certain as you seem to be. I said, I'm not certain. I am aware. Those are different things. She considered that. She said, what are you aware of? I said, that this is the most alive I have felt in a professional context in several years, and that the professional context is only part of it, and that I am willing to be patient with your timeline if you are willing to stay in the conversation. She said, I am in the conversation. She said it with a directness that settled something in me. I have been in the conversation since November. She paused. Possibly since October. October was the stairwell. The first one, the screaming and the wall. I said, the stairwell. She said, the stairwell. We looked at each other. The specific quality of the look was one I will not try to make smaller than it was by cataloging it precisely. It was the kind of look that happens when two people have spent long enough circling a thing that they have both become fluent in the shape of it without having said it directly, and the recognition of that fluency is itself a form of arrival. She said, give me time. Not to decide whether, to decide how. I said, take the time. She nodded. She straightened from the wall. She said in the professional voice, nearly but not entirely unaffected, I need to speak with Dr. Benoit about the Voss situation directly. I said, he will appreciate that. She passed me on the stairs, her sleeve brushed my arm. Neither of us acknowledged it. Both of us felt it. I stood on the step for a moment after she was gone, and let the stairwell be a stairwell again, just concrete and iron and the sound of the building around it. And then I went back to my archive and my work, which was waiting for me with the reliability of everything that does not require you to figure out how to be brave. The meeting between Selene and Harriet Voss happened the following week, and I was not present for it, but Selene told me about it that evening in a terse 4-sentence message that said Voss had been professional, that the conversation had been brief, that the conduct guidelines had been reviewed in the meeting and found to have no bearing on the current situation, and that Voss had expressed, in the specifically coded language of board-level concern, the hope that the Institute's research priorities would remain the primary focus of all senior staff relationships. Selene had responded, according to her own account, by thanking Voss for the meeting and for her commitment to the institution. The 5th line of the message, below the institutional close, handwritten, she is the kind of person who requires others to be smaller in order to feel the correct size. I find that I no longer have patience for it. I read that line several times. The word no longer was doing significant work in it. The fact that she had told me this at all was doing even more. I wrote back, "Then don't be smaller." Her reply, 12 minutes later, "I am working on that." February moved through the city in its characteristically grudging way. The Institute was mid-season, several major projects in progress, the Moreau work entering its final cataloging phase, a new acquisition from a private collector in the south of France that was scheduled to arrive in March, and that had generated considerable internal excitement because the collector's estate was rumored to contain correspondence between two significant figures of early 20th century French literature that had never been publicly available. Solène was assigned to lead the initial conservation assessment of the new acquisition. I was assigned to develop the cataloging framework. This meant that we were working toward the same deadline from our respective disciplines and meeting regularly to coordinate, which was professionally seamless and personally a sustained exercise in maintaining two separate registers of attention simultaneously. One focused on the work and one focused on the specific awareness of her that I had entirely failed to reduce over the course of 4 months. She was different in February than she had been in October. Not different in the fundamental way the precision was still there, the economy of speech, the stillness that was not emptiness, but there was something in the architecture of how she moved through the day that had changed. She initiated more. She asked questions that went beyond the functional. She remained in conversations longer before returning to work. She came to the East Corridor once when she had no professional reason to be there and stood looking at the river view from the archive window for several minutes without explanation, and when I looked at her from my desk and she looked back, she said only, "Good light this afternoon," and then went back to her lab. I found a poem in my internal mailbox on a Tuesday. The Institute used the internal mail for small documents and objects that were too large or physical for email sample materials. Annotated physical pages, the occasional formal memo. The envelope was plain and had my name on it in her handwriting. Inside was a photocopy of a poem. Not new, it was clearly from a collection, the page showing the slight distortion of an aged book. The poem was by an early 20th century poet I did not recognize, written in French with a typed English translation beside it. I will not quote it here because it does not need to be quoted to be understood. What I will say is that it was about the condition of standing very close to something that changes the light and not knowing whether the change is the thing itself or the changed light that matters more, and that it ended on an image of two people in a doorway who have decided to stop pretending the door is the point. There was nothing else in the envelope. No note. Just the poem. I sat at my desk and read it twice and then placed it in my desk drawer, in the folder where I had been keeping the handwritten notes. The folder that had started as a professional record and had become, without my deciding that it would, something else. I did not message her that afternoon. I thought about the poem instead, which is what the poem required. The following morning, I left an envelope in her mailbox. Inside was a photocopy of a single photograph from the Moreau collection, one that I had been looking at for weeks during the cataloging process. Not the most historically significant piece in the collection, but one of the ones that had stayed with me. It showed two women in a garden in what appeared to be the early 1930s, facing each other across a stone table with the expression of people who are saying something important without saying it. The photographic composition was extraordinary. Whoever had taken the image had understood something about the geometry of two people deciding the distance between them. I had written nothing on the back. I trusted her to know why I had sent it. She came to the archive at 4 that afternoon and stood in my doorway. I looked up from my work. She said, "The women in the garden." I said, "Yes." She held the photograph. She looked at it for a moment and then she looked at me and she said, "The composition is deliberate. The photographer understood what they were documenting." I said, "I thought you would see that." She was quiet for a moment in the doorway. She said, "I am almost ready." I said, "I know." She said, "Almost is not nothing." I said, "Almost is everything up to the last part." She looked at the photograph one more time. She said, "I'll keep this, if that's all right." I said, "It's why I sent it." She nodded. She left. I put my hands flat on my desk and looked at the surface of it and breathed, and the breathing was the kind that comes after the held thing releases slightly, not all the way, but enough to know it is moving. March arrived and with it the French acquisition. The estate of the collector, a man named Gilles Fonterre, who had died in November at 93, and whose tastes had apparently run to the monumental and the personal in equal measure, delivered 17 crates to the Institute's loading bay on a Wednesday morning in the first week of the month. The crates contained papers, photographs, objects, textiles, and, as the rumor had suggested, A significant quantity of correspondence that had been stored in archival boxes within a larger sealed trunk that had apparently not been opened since Fontaire's acquisition of it in the 1970s. The correspondence. Once the trunk was opened under conservatorial supervision, Solenne's supervision, conducted with the kind of focused ceremony that significant openings require, turned out to be extraordinary. 112 letters, in excellent condition considering their age, between two writers who had been, as the letters made immediately clear, not merely colleagues, but something the letters themselves refused to name directly and named precisely through everything they refused to name. The Institute's research community was electrified. Dr. Benoit sent an email to the board. Two scholars who had been studying one of the correspondence for decades requested immediate access. The letters were going to require careful conservation treatment before they could be handled by researchers, which put the timeline in Solenne's hands, and the cataloging and contextual research were going to require my team's full engagement for at least 6 weeks. What the letters did to me, personally, was something I had not anticipated. I spent the first 2 days reviewing photographic documentation of the correspondence before the physical letters were accessible for handling, developing the catalog framework, and the contextual research plan. The letters were written between 1928 and 1935, 7 years of two people speaking to each other in the language they had available, which was the language of intellectual exchange and literary discussion and professional admiration, threaded through with something else that existed in every line and was never once called by its name. They were extraordinary as literary artifacts. They were also, reading them in sequence, the record of two people standing in a very long doorway and arguing with themselves about whether to walk through it. On the third day, Solène came to the reading room where I was working and sat across from me and put a photograph on the table. It was documentation of one of the later letters, dated 1934. She said, "Have you read this one?" I had. The letter was the one where the tone shifted, where one of the writers stopped performing the literary register and said, in plain declarative sentences, that she had been afraid and that the fear had cost her years that she was no longer willing to offer it. I said yes, Solène said. She waited until the last possible moment. I said, she waited until she was sure. Solène said, she waited until she was almost too late. I looked at her across the reading room table with its pool of lamplight and its careful archival surface, and I said, "What are you telling me?" She said, "I am telling you that I have finished taking the time I needed." The reading room was very quiet. It was early evening, the institute was largely empty, the last of the other staff having left in the preceding hour. The lamp on the table between us made a warm circle that reached both of us. I said, "And what did the time tell you?" She said, "That I have spent 4 months learning who you are, and that what I have learned is that you are someone I want to be fully honest with." She paused. Fully. Not through handwritten footnotes and sent photographs. She paused again. Directly. I said, "Then be direct." She held my gaze. She said, "I am in love with you." I believe I have been since considerably before I had any right to say so or any framework for saying it that didn't require me to also say that I was afraid and that the fear was making decisions on my behalf. She breathed. I have decided to stop letting the fear make the decisions. The lamp, the letters in their archival folders, the reading room, with its institutional smell of careful preservation. Her face across the table with the stillness gone, replaced by something that was not the absence of composure but its honest form, the composure of someone who has said the true thing and is waiting to find out what the true thing means. I said, "I have been in love with you since the stairwell." She said, "The first one or the second one?" I said, "The first one. When you went silent and put your hands on the wall." I said, "I didn't know it was that. Yet. But it was that." She said, "I didn't know either. I knew something had happened that I couldn't put back." I stood up. I came around the table. She stood as I reached her, and there was a moment, the last of the long series of moments that had been building since October, where we were standing directly in front of each other with no desk and no professional distance. And no almost. She put her hand against my face. Cool palm, warm underneath. The ink-stained fingers I had been noticing for 4 months. She held my face with the same precision she brought to everything completely, deliberately, as if she had decided to hold this specific thing and would not be careless with it. I put my hand over hers. She said, very quietly, "I owe you the honest version of the first stairwell." I said, "Tell me." She said, "You said that I treated the human variables as obstacles to the work. And you were right. But it wasn't about the work. It was about the fact that you were the most significant human variable I had encountered in a very long time, and I had no system for that. I became defensive because I was frightened. I said Miss Solis because I needed the title to put the distance back. I said, I know. She said, do you know that I went home that evening and stood in my apartment for 30 minutes thinking about the way you looked at me when the distance came back? Like you had been expecting it? I said I had been. She said, I don't want you to expect it anymore. I said, then don't put it back. She said, I won't. Then she kissed me. It was not tentative. It had the quality of her handwritten notes, precise, fully considered, meaning exactly what it said and not performing the meaning but delivering it. My hand was still over hers against my face, and I brought my other hand to her waist, and she made a sound that was very quiet and very immediate and entirely unlike anything the professional register had ever produced. When we pulled back, it was only a little. Her forehead came to rest against mine. We stayed like that in the lamplight with the letters of two women who had waited too long arranged around us in their careful archival folders, and the institute quiet around us, and the city beyond the windows making its ordinary noise, and none of it was smaller than it should have been. She said, against my temple, in the French that came back to her in the unguarded moments, Je t'ai attendu très longtemps. I said, I know some French. She said, how much? I said, enough. She laughed. It was the real one, the low and startled one, the one I had heard twice before and hoarded both times. This one I did not need to hoard. The weeks that followed had a quality that I had not previously had access to. Not simpler, nothing about two people who are both constitutionally precise and professionally serious becomes simple by adding love to the equation. But more honest. Comprehensively honest. In the way that happens when you have been careful for a long time and the carefulness finally has somewhere to land, we told Dr. Benoit first, because he deserved to know from us rather than from the kind of institutional rumor that had already attempted to make something smaller out of something it did not understand. We sat in his office on a Thursday morning, both of us, and I said that our relationship had moved beyond the professional and that we were disclosing it in accordance with the guidelines and that we wanted to be transparent with him before anyone else. He listened with the expression of someone hearing information he had predicted and prepared for. When we finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I am glad it is you telling me and not Harriet Voss. He paused. I am also glad it is you telling me at all, rather than managing it privately until it became something that required management rather than acknowledgement. He looked at his desk. He looked at us. He said, the conduct guidelines require that I note this in your personnel files and confirm there is no supervisory conflict. He paused. There is no supervisory conflict. He put his pen down. The Moreau collection was the best managed acquisition in a decade, he said again. I note that for the record. We thanked him. We left. In the corridor, Solène looked at me with an expression that was the composed version of something that was not composed at all, and she said, he's known since December. I said, he's known since November. She said, how? I said, Adisa. She considered this. She said, your colleague, the photographer. I said, he watches things very carefully and he says very little about what he sees. I find it a useful quality. She was quiet. Then she said, I would like to meet him properly. I said, he'll find that amusing. She said, why? I said, because he already knows everything and will have to pretend he doesn't. The edge of her mouth lifted. I had stopped hoarding those too. The disclosure to Harriet Voss was handled differently formally, through the board chair, with the documentation that the guidelines required and the professional language that institutional communication demands. Voss acknowledged it in writing. Her response was correct and cold, and I suspect cost her some effort to keep as correct as it was, which I noted without unkindness. Adisa said nothing when I told him. He looked at me for a moment with those quiet eyes, and then he said, how is she? Meaning Solène. I said, good. More than good. He nodded. He said, she came here last week. To the photography archive. She wanted to look at a specific type of photographic paper used in the 1930s. She stayed for an hour. She asked good questions. I said, she does that. He said, she also looked at the photograph I took of you in October. The one where you were working at the East table and didn't know I had the camera. She looked at it for a long time. I said, you took a photograph of me without telling me. He said, I take photographs of things I find significant. He paused, then added, with the mildness that was his version of warmth. She said it was a good likeness. I told her it was the easiest subject I had photographed in years. Not because you hold still. You don't. Because you are always doing the same thing. which is paying attention, and attention photographs the same way twice. I stood there for a moment with no useful response. He went back to his work. That evening, I found a small photograph on my desk, unlabeled, not from the collection. It was a new print, clearly taken with his personal camera. It showed the east corridor of the archive, empty in the winter morning light, with the long shadows of the window frames on the floor making a grid of dark and bright. It was beautiful the way some simple things are simply beautiful, without requiring explanation. I understood that he had been watching carefully for longer than he had let on, and that the watching had always been the kind that wished well. I put it in the folder with the notes and the poem and the garden photograph. The folder had become an archive of its own. Spring arrived at the Institute the way it arrived in that part of the city, incrementally, and then suddenly, a week of tentative warmth, then a week that felt like reversal. Then one morning when the light through the north-facing conservation lab windows had an entirely different quality, and the air coming through the ventilation smelled like something green and possible, Solène noticed it the same morning I did. I know because she sent me a 2-word message at 7:18 that said, "The light," and nothing else. I replied, "I know," and nothing else, which was, for us, a complete conversation. The Fonterre letters were cleared for researcher access by the end of April, after 12 weeks of conservation treatment that Solène oversaw with the focused care she brought to everything she touched. The first scholar to work with the full correspondence was a woman from a university in Bordeaux who had spent 20 years studying one of the letter writers and who sat in the Institute's reading room on her first day with the collection and did not speak for 40 minutes. She simply read. When she finally looked up, she had the expression of someone who has been waiting for the rest of a story and has finally received it. She said to me at the end of that first session, "They spent 7 years saying it without saying it, and then they said it." I said yes. She said, "The reader can see it from the beginning, every letter." I said, "That's what makes them extraordinary." She said, "It's also what makes them painful, all the time before the saying." I said, "I think they needed the time. I think the time was part of it." She looked at me with the particular attention of a scholar who has just received an interpretive frame she finds useful. She said, "That's a generous reading." I said, "I believe it." The Spring Institute Gala was held in May, the evening before a weekend, in the 4th floor common area, with the windows opened for the first time since October. The city came in. The iron beams above us held the warm light. There were more people than the December reception. The gala was a public donor event, considerably larger. The Institute, in its most formal presentation of itself, with the board and the donors and the researchers and the 3 scholars from the Bordeaux University who had come specifically because the Fonterre letters had generated the kind of scholarly attention that filled conference programs the next several years. Théo came. My sister, who had been hearing about all of this in the installments that a close relationship with a private person allows, which is to say, in pieces, over months, with context arriving late, and the most significant information arriving last, came down from Montclair for the evening because she said she needed to see the building and because what she meant was that she needed to see Solène, and I did not try to tell her otherwise. She arrived wearing a yellow dress that was the exact opposite of institutional, and she stood in the east corridor with her hands on her hips and looked at the archive stacks and said, "You love this place as much as you love her." I said, "Yes." She said, "Good. They should be the same scale of thing." She hugged me once, tight, before the event began, and then she went to find the catering table because she has her priorities clearly ranked. I wore the black dress again because it had served well before. Solène wore something the color of deep water, structured the same way she structured everything, and she came down the main staircase of the Institute at the same moment I came through the east corridor door, and we saw each other from across the room before the event had properly begun. She crossed the room, not hurrying, not performing, just moving toward me with the directness that was entirely native to her, the way she moved toward everything she had decided to engage with fully. She stood in front of me. She said, "You wore the black dress." I said, "It seemed appropriate." She said, "It is more than appropriate." I said, "So is the blue." She said, "It was a considered choice." I said, "I know. Everything you wear is considered." She looked at me with the thing that was not quite a smile and was now also its own thing, its own expression that I had not been able to name in October, and had since come to know as the one she reserved for the moments when she was feeling something she was no longer trying to manage. The months of learning it had made it available to me the way the most important things become available through repetition and attention and the willingness to look when looking costs something. She said, I have been thinking about the letter writer who finally said it in 1934. I said, what about her? She said, I think you were right that she needed the time. I also think she would have said, if asked, that the time was the most expensive thing she had ever spent and that she is glad it is behind her. I said, is that a self-portrait? She said, obviously. I said, then I'm glad it's behind you too. She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she touched my hand, briefly, in the public room with the donors and the board and the iron beams above us, in the institute that had been the site of screaming and silence and handwritten notes and a poem about a doorway, just her fingers against my knuckles. Just the lightest possible contact, fully chosen, meaning exactly what it was. She said, come and get a drink with me. I said, I will go anywhere with you. She said, Hunt is a large claim. I said, I have good evidence for it. She said, your methodology is sound. I said, I learned from a rigorous reader. The edge of her mouth lifted all the way. The real smile, the one that changed the whole geography of her face. I had not stopped being undone by it. I had simply learned to be undone without requiring recovery. We walked together into the warm room, toward the drink table and the window and the city and the evening and whatever came after it, which was something neither of us had yet written but both of us had already begun. Months later, winter again, the second winter, with its flat white light and its honesty about the condition of things, I found a new folder in my desk drawer. Someone had put it there while I was at a cataloging meeting. It was unlabeled. Inside was a handwritten note in Solen's precise, slightly slanted hand, on a single page, not a footnote, not below an institutional signature, just a page. It said, I have been thinking about accuracy. You told me in November of last year that you had an accurate account of who I was. I did not believe you then. I believe you now, in the way that matters, not because I am the same as I was, but because you have been paying the kind of attention that makes accuracy possible even when the subject is still changing. I want you to know that I am aware of the attention, that I have been aware of it since October, that it is one of the things I love most, which is not a small category. You do not give attention lightly, neither do I. I find that what we have made out of our respective carefulness is something I did not expect to have. I am grateful for it in a way I am still learning to say without precision failing me. All I can offer in its place is this. I see you, completely, and I am staying. S. I sat at my desk and held the page and felt the thing that is not the same as happiness, but is happiness's quieter and more permanent form, the one that settles rather than blazes, that does not require the validation of crisis or novelty to confirm that it is real. I had been looking for the accurate account of who she was since October. She had been building the account of me in parallel, in the careful way she did everything, and she had arrived at this. I had a folder of notes and a poem and a photograph and now a letter from a woman who had walked into the institute in the autumn with ink on her fingers and an opinion about a methodology gap and no patience for approximation, who had screamed at me in a stairwell and known she was wrong before the last word was out, who had put both hands on the wall in the silence after, and stood there in the space between what we were and what we were going to be, and held the distance until we both knew what the distance cost and decided, finally, that it cost too much. I took a new page and wrote back, not footnoted, not attached to anything professional, just the page. It said, I started paying attention in October. I intend to continue. Everything I have learned from attending to you has been worth the learning, including the parts that required patience and the parts that were expensive, and the part in the stairwell where I was angry and you were wrong, and neither of those things was the point. The point was that you went still instead of defensive. That was when I knew. I have been knowing it in various degrees of honesty since then. I am fully honest about it now. I see you. I am also staying. I put it in an envelope. I put her name on it in my own hand. I took it to her lab. She was at the light table when I came in, reading something through the magnifying glass, fully focused, the whole of her attention on the work the way it always was, the way it had been since the first morning she arrived, and the way it would be for as long as there was work worth giving attention to. She looked up when she heard the door. I held out the envelope. She looked at it. She looked at me. She took it. She set it beside the light table, unopened, with the care she gave to everything that deserved care. She would read it later, in the way she read everything completely, without rushing, giving it the space it required. She said, the Fonterre secondary correspondence. The assessment is complete. I said, what's the condition? She said, excellent, better than expected. I said, good. She said, the cataloging timeline holds. I said, then we're in good shape. She said, we are. She looked at me for a moment longer than the professional conversation required. The light through the north windows was the flat winter kind, honest about the condition of things, and in it she looked exactly as she was, precise and tired and brilliant and mine, in the only way I had ever wanted to be someone's, which was the way that knew all the parts. She said, "Go back to your archive." I said, "I'm going." She said, "Imara." I stopped at the door. She said quietly and without any ambiguity at all, "I'll find you later." I said, "I'll be there." I went back to my archive, to my maps and my folders and my careful records of things that had survived long enough to be worth preserving. Outside the windows, the city was the winter version of itself, the clear, cold kind, and the stairwell was a stairwell again with its concrete and its iron, and the light was accurate, and everything was in its right place. And the woman I loved was 30 feet away, reading a letter I had written her on a plain page with no institutional footer and nothing beneath it but the truth, which had turned out, in the end, to be more than enough.